Welcome everybody to this webinar presenting the IFLA Trend Report, and you'll see it's from 2024 and we're doing this in 2025. I'll explain a little bit more about the process that we've been following up to now, but clearly we're extremely happy to have you here. What we're going to be trying to achieve during this session, what we're talking about is running through why we have a trend report, why we focus on this as a topic, why, as IFLA, we believe that this is a really important thing for libraries to be thinking about, presenting some of the ideas that are in there, the content that's available for you to use within your associations, within your work, presenting some of the ways to play, ideas that we've shared within there about how you can make best use of the report, and then finally leaving some time for some questions and answers at the end. I am otherwise Stephen White, Director of Policy and Advocacy at the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. It's always good to set out what we're hoping to do with these sorts of events. So just to share up front what I think our goals are for the 70 minutes or so that we've got together. Firstly, I hope that you'll be able to come out of this with an understanding of firstly why we think that futures thinking, that integrating the future into our planning matters, and that hopefully you'll agree that it matters, that it's important. Secondly, that you'll be able to start thinking yourselves about how you can use the trend report. Really, success for us will be if you can take that report, if you can go out there and actually, if you can take it, if you can think of new ways that we've not even imagined of applying it within your association, within your institution, with your colleagues, even just in your own personal reflection about what it is that we need as a field to be resilient, to be effective, to be able to fulfill our missions going into the future. And then finally, a goal that we'll step closer to actually making that a reality, making that systematic reflection on the future part of the way that we work today. So just to start ourselves off, and this is the introduction I was keen to do at the beginning, is just talking a little bit more about exactly what it is that we're trying to achieve, that why we think that those futures matter. And you'll see that, therefore, it's an introduction to futures thinking, but I think what's really important is that word inclusive, because we'll be trying to make the argument that actually futures thinking, it's a discipline, it's a fun hobby, it's a great thing to do on an away day, on a retreat or something like that. But also it's an issue about equity, it's an issue about impact, it's an issue about our ability to actually fulfill our missions properly. So, but to start, we're going to do a little Menti slide. I'm sure post-pandemic, everyone is familiar with this. It's the one that isn't Slido. And so I'm going to ask everyone, go on to menti.com, so the URL that you see at the top of the screen, and then use the code 77377012. So I'll give you a couple of minutes just to look at that. And the question is, how far do you agree with the following statement, that you already think systematically yourselves about the future when you're planning, and that secondly, the library field in general thinks systematically about the future when planning? So I can see we've got 80 participants. 12 of you have logged in already. Good, that's going up. Excellent, we have our first voters. Thank you. What we'll normally do is when we've got to about a half of people have voted, we can start talking. So I'll give you just a moment to look through that and think. And as you can see, these two questions are quite closely linked to two of the objectives that we have for this session. Great, I think we'll make half. That's at least 40 people. Half of you are now logged in. Okay, so I think we can already see, just before we talk about the actual results, already there's quite a spread of responses, that there are people who strongly agree that this is both the case for themselves and for the field as a whole, and there are people who strongly disagree, which I think is entirely normal. I think it's already interesting to see that in terms of, I think we're seeing overall as an average score, 4.2 is therefore somewhere between agree and strongly agree. I think the individuals who are on this event are a bit more confident about how they're doing, which I guess at the same time, if you register for an event about futures, there's probably a reason for it. So this probably isn't the most scientific sample, but we're slightly less confident that the library field as a whole thinks systematically about the future when planning, which I think, yeah, again, I think that makes sense. I think absolutely. I think we will come back to some of these questions and confidence in where we go in the future. But I think, okay, we've got a good start to go on there. So I wanted to do just then a little bit more presentation on why the trend report. I think a first key reason for doing the trend report is that actually we do already always think about futures. It's a very human thing. It's an evolutionary imperative to actually be reflecting about what might the future look like? What might happen tomorrow? What might happen in the next minute, in the next hour, the next year? This is a key part to how we actually survive. We stock up, we take decisions because we make assumptions, we think about what's in the future. The problem is we may not do that consciously. And I think critically, we tend to make an assumption that the future will be like the present. They're very much pre-wired, hardwired to do that. And the challenge with this is that we make assumptions. We don't know their assumptions. We believe they're truths. We don't necessarily question how reasonable, how probable these assumptions actually are. And so the risk is we end up with tunnel vision or tunnel foresight, as we put in the title here. And this can, some of the time, it'll be true. Maybe it's the single most likely outcome. But by doing that, we fail to take account of what might happen elsewhere, potential surprises, potential changes, things that potentially, we invest in a service and a function that's no longer necessary. We fail to invest in a skill set, in a type of collection, in a type of engagement that only becomes more important. And both of those, as failures to take account of what might happen in the future, potentially lead to loss. They lead to a loss of relevance. They lead to a loss of an ability to fulfill those more eternal missions about supporting the fulfillment of human rights, the development, the realization of potential through not access to knowledge and information. Critically, there's not just one future, there's more than one future. So you already see, and this is a graph taken from Voros, that in the middle, the little blue circle you have on the right, that's that projected future. That's what happens if things continue as now. But actually, there's a cone. You can go out towards plausible futures, probable futures, possible futures. There's a whole variety of different ways in which the world could go, and the future will lie somewhere within one of these circles. And crucially as well, simply talking about futures is neutral. There are obviously better futures and worse futures that we might face. There are situations that we would prefer to be in. And I think really importantly within this, we're not powerless to prepare for this. We're not powerless either to try and shape things. The networks that we have, the presence that we have, the expertise, the reach that we have, we can be agents in this. And so you also see this green circle, this green oval that you have there, setting out those preferable futures, the ones we actually want. So I think when looking at the future, I said it's important to think about futures in the plural, that more than one may happen, that we could end up with something that's completely unexpected, but also to go in there not just as passive takers of what happened, but also thinking hard and thinking confidently about what we can do to actually shape it. This is also an equity issue, arguably. Now, I don't know, as I said, everyone thinks about futures. Not everyone thinks about futures in a conscious, purposeful way. But there are actors who do. They often come from the energy industry. They often come from the defense industry. If you look at the history of futures thinking, it's organizations like the Rand Corporation, which was effectively a think tank for the US military in the Cold War. It's organizations like Shell, which many people have issues with, given their focus on fossil fuels. But these are companies that have been thinking this stuff through, and that gives them an upper hand. It allows them to actually pick strategies, pick ideas, ways of doing things, investments that are more likely to pay off under different circumstances, leaving behind those who only put all of their eggs into one basket, assume, gamble effectively on one particular future happening. By doing that, they're more resilient, they can be more successful, and it gives them a stronger level of influence over the future because they have that understanding that they can change things, that they can act. Of course, if they're doing that, it means that they're taking decisions that others aren't. So one angle is, of course, that then if these companies are doing it, major governments are doing it, so should actors like libraries, which have the charge, have the responsibility, the duty of doing something as important as providing access to knowledge and information for everyone. At the same time, it's not just something that we should be scared of, that we should feel that we are pressured into in order to keep up with companies, with governments, with others. It's also something that's empowering. There's a really valuable role of futures thinking in actually looking back and challenging our assumptions, realizing that things that we assumed were true, assumed were permanent, assumed were given, actually aren't. They are constructs. They're things that we've invented, that we've assumed. It's also a way, as I said, of looking at thinking about our own agency, our ability to change things ourselves, to make the world better. And so it can be something that's really empowering, both at an individual level, but also at a community level, and bring people together, discovering things that motivate us, things that we assume are true. So it can also be a really positive, empowering thing, especially when it's made available to people who otherwise may not be asked their opinion, who may just be assumed to accept, to survive, to have to make do with what happens with them. And so there is actually an argument that futures literacy could and should be a basic skill that everyone has. Certainly you look at organizations like UNESCO and they promote this, and certainly through the Trend Report, it's something that hopefully we can spread throughout the library field as a whole. The goal of the Trend Report as a whole, therefore, is as a conversation starter. As I said, this is here to be a tool that's available, that's there to really help you fulfill your missions. Clearly, it's supposed to be generative. It's supposed to start conversations rather than actually end them. I think crucially, you should not see this. You should absolutely not only read the Trend Report. You should think about how you make use of it, how you value it, how you can really use it as a tool, make it your own. It's not proprietary, it's there under a Creative Commons license. It looks very strongly on it looks at what's currently happening, and it really focuses initially on how to identify those trends, those broad issues, developments, issues that are having an impact. And crucially, the focus is on the knowledge and information environment. So we did, when putting it together and when thinking about the scope, we decided not to focus purely on the library field, partly because there's already some excellent work out there by other actors looking at specific library trends. We also avoided looking at broad mega trends in the world. There are, again, lots of organizations that produce documents like this, and which of course we have drawn on quite heavily, but rather to focus on knowledge and information. And idea for that is, firstly, it tells us some very important things about the climate, about the environment in which libraries are working and which libraries make work in the future. It also makes it possible to start some conversations with other actors in our space, people who are also working with information and knowledge in the digital space, in the education space, in the knowledge space. So that's the reason for that particular focus. And a strong theme in this, and this is certainly not something that's gone away since the report was first presented, but everything is taking place clearly in the context of rapid technological advancement. Generative AI continues to be a really important issue, one that really is challenging us, making us think about who does what, about the models of our society, how we actually make things work. So the first step, and this was the first part of the Trend Report that we were able to put out already in just under a year ago, is the literature review. This is based on a horizon scan, a really comprehensive, thorough scan of around 555 sources that look to actually identify trends. And these come from different places, different domains, national contexts. They look at socioeconomic issues, geopolitical, consumer, business, technology, risk, and information. These really focus on some of those mega trends, but also those within that knowledge sector. There was, at the same time, clearly 555 it's a big number, but it's not all of them. I know that Michael and Kim, certainly when they talk about the report, they're very clear that this is only a partial collection. I think they're also clear that the practice of developing trend reports is not global at the moment. And so You can see this as a weakness. I think we see this as an opportunity, in that it's an opportunity also for librarians drawing on your experience of what's happening on the ground to think, well, how can I complement that? What's missing? And so certainly as we get to the trends, I really encourage you to think about how you work through those. So how you work through those, what's missing, what can you add on to make these more effective? Michael and Kim then went through, they coded, they synthesized the individual trends, looking for patterns, looking for where things ran together. And what they've come up with, and what we'll share in a second, is a set of 7 high-level trends. But I think crucially, within each of these, there are a set of sub-trends. And some of these go in the same direction, some of them complement each other. But I think importantly, some of them actually cross over. Some of them actually run into each other, leading to frictions, leading to tensions, leading to contradictions, which I think is also one of the interesting things about this, is looking at what happens when that actually looking at what happens there. In doing that, we were very happy to be able to draw on the contributions of the Trend Report Advisory Committee, a group of people who came forward, who brought their own experience of working with trends, of working with the previous IFLA Trend Report, in order to sense check these ideas, to highlight what was missing, in order to make sure that this is the most comprehensive, most useful report possible for the field at the date it was produced. What the report also contains, and this is an innovation compared to the previous one, is scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about scenarios later. But I think crucially with the trend report, the idea is not just to talk about trends, because each trend exists, no trend exists in isolation. The trends, it's very easy to set them out in 7 different sections, but then in the real world, they'll all run together, they will interact, they'll interchange with each other. It's unpredictable. The way each trend works together will lead to different outcomes. And that's why we have futures. This is why we have scenarios, because for us, the way we think about things, it's really powerful to be able to actually imagine different ways in which the world might end up, different ways in which that knowledge and information environment, how this might be in the future. So what you also have in the trend report is a set of these scenarios. There's 16 in total, 10 provided by the author team, 6 provided by externals. And what these do is look at different ways in which those trends might actually play out, those different futures that we might have. The example I gave earlier is one based on the concept that we have that rise of AI, we have inequalities in access to digital. So we'll come on to those ideas in a moment. You'll see some of those ideas coming out. But crucially, they're a catalyst. The idea is there to get us thinking, to get us testing some of our assumptions, to get us testing some of our plans. That if we continue doing what we are today, what will happen if that particular future comes out? I said there's the chance of any single one of them coming true as written is absolutely minimal. At the same time, it's building that habit of being flexible is important. So let's get on to the trends. So the first trend that Michael and Kim identified is around knowledge practices are changing. This is a pretty fundamental one. Is that simply it's the fact that what we see as knowledge today is different, and what we will potentially see as knowledge tomorrow is different to how we see it today. This raises some pretty fundamental challenges. It does, of course, also raise some opportunities. So I think there's a positive side of things, definitely within here, that there is, compared to where we were 50 years ago, 100 years ago, even 10 years ago, there's a greater readiness to recognize that different experiences, different inputs, different lived experiences count as knowledge. We're getting beyond the snobbishness, the exclusion that used to exist when we simply assumed that only materials produced by a particular type of person from a particular type of world counted as knowledge. This is definitely an improvement, even if at the same time, clearly, we also see political forces that try to deny the validity of these experiences, the validity of this sort of knowledge. At the same time, we are seeing, and we'll talk more about AI, obviously, in the next one, but we are seeing a rise in misinformation. Now, clearly, lying has always existed. That's nothing new. but the ease of producing it, the speed with which it can be shared, the ability of almost anyone to produce something convincing that really sort of avoids all of the safeguards that would normally have in place. That is a new thing. There's no sign of that going away. So the fact that the risk of not being able to necessarily believe what you see is growing compared to where we were before. We are also seeing new ways of creating, sharing, and using information. Certainly, the rise of the Internet of Things, again, nothing new, is making it possible to collect a vast amount of data. And even if we think within the library field, previously the way in which someone reads a book, where they stop, where they start, the number of words, pages they read at once, the speed, what they skip. Previously, we didn't necessarily think of this as data because it wasn't easy to collect. Now it's very easy to collect. We have a whole lot of information that we previously didn't necessarily have or weren't able to collect. And there's a sense that we can value that, we can use it. For each of the trends, Michael and Kim really helpfully suggest a couple of questions and initial ways that we can interrogate ourselves about these trends. So a first question within this is, how can we build skills in the community to counter misinformation? I think crucially, if you can no longer necessarily believe your eyes, what can you believe? How can you actually avoid being duped? One consequence here. How can you use new tools, new forms to actually share information? So the question they've raised here is around short form video, that how can you use these sort of TikTok style materials that clearly have proved themselves to be extremely powerful, have proved themselves to be very effective in many things as a tool that's available to us. And another question that certainly comes out from what we've been talking about so far, how do we actually better reflect what are the types of knowledge, what are the experiences that we have undervalued in the past? How do we make sure that we're actually giving them space in an appropriate way and in a consensual way? So that's trend one. Second one, obviously, we have to talk about AI because everyone is. But yep, I think I don't think this will be controversial. The fact that AI and other technologies are transforming society by transforming the way that we connect with each other, the way that we communicate. Clearly, generative AI has both huge potential and huge harms. And there are some very positive trends, ideas mentioned within the report around the potential of generative AI to help, we'd say, leapfrog. So, for example, in countries and situations where there's very little access to relevant educational material, where there's very little access to research materials and so on, generative AI does offer some possibilities to fill gaps in availability, to build materials that are based on local content, but which then allow for learning in more modern ways that help really advance things without having to go through a longer process. It also does offer possibilities for efficiencies to do things like literature reviews more quickly, obviously with sensible safeguards. At the same time, it does also raise some major questions around the ability of people, I think, the value of certain jobs, whether certain jobs will exist in the future. We've already mentioned concerns about misinformation, about misinformation, the ability to generate convincing but ultimately untrue information to confuse, or for even more nefarious, for more negative purposes. We also see other forms of technology. A really interesting one highlighted is the role of digital twins. The example given is that of Tuvalu. There's a pun. You can also, given that Tuvalu is extremely low-lying, there is the reality that as long as sea rises continue, the physical country is likely to disappear in a few years. So the government of Tuvalu has created Tuvalu, but written TWO, Valu. It is a digital twin. The idea is to create as far as possible, to safeguard as far as possible the national culture, the national heritage in digital format, so that when what sadly looks inevitable happens, there is at least that way of keeping touch, of keeping in contact with that heritage, of not losing what it means to come from Tuvalu. At the same time, you have similar models, arguably the way that social media companies build up profiles of other companies, build up profiles of who we are. That creates a digital twin for us as individuals, which raises some pretty serious questions around privacy, even if it also obviously makes it easier for companies to serve us in ways that actually at least reflect the ways that we've done things in the past. So there's some interesting questions there about the ethics, ownership over digital twins, the potential that there is, but also the risks. The question that Kim and Michael suggested is around focus on how we're thinking to ourselves about how will AI impact some of those key functions that libraries serve, that libraries rely on around language, learning, translation, creation of content and information. What does it mean when we're in a world where there are both AI generated content and human generated content? Do we value one more? Is there a premium on human generated content? There's some really interesting questions to dig into there. Next, trend 3 is around trust is being negotiated. And we see from surveys, obviously focus on the parts of the world that these surveys focus on, that we do see that government and media are increasingly not particularly well trusted. There is a sense that some of the sources that used to very much determine what people should think and inform ideas are no longer trusted in the same way. Governments too are suffering from a lack of trust, and clearly populism and sharing particular ideas about the state are not particularly helping in that respect. At the same time, these same surveys do indicate that scientists, to some extent, still benefit from a level of trust. Certainly, libraries continue to benefit from a level of trust. Even companies on specific issues continue to benefit from a level of trust, and there's an assumption that they may be neutral rather than necessarily evil. So we're seeing questions around this being renegotiated. And I think crucial in this is this idea of renegotiation, that we are beyond a world, and this is what the trend points to, that we're beyond a world where simply it's okay to stand up and say, trust me, and expect that that will actually happen. In fact, often the reverse happens now, that demanding trust is likely to lead to mistrust. At the same time, there needs to be trust, there needs to be confidence. Governments continue to have a key role in providing services. If people do not engage, if people do not use them, the services don't have their impact, and government services have a key role in providing for public goods and providing for commons. Similarly, with the media, a good media, a strong, diverse media is vital for democracy. So we need to find ways of rebuilding, of renegotiating that trust. Sadly, at the moment, we are seeing decline in the media, in particular in the local media, which really speaks to people about their own areas. It really sort of supports the building of communities. And we also see concerns, and I think there's a growing questions out there about the logic of open for open's sake. Certainly within the open access movement, there's an awareness, firstly, that it's important that just making stuff open, we need to think about business models and the impact those business models might have, but also that greater readiness to realize that maybe open isn't the best situation in every example, every case. Certainly awareness of the importance of respecting the rights of Indigenous communities is growing, that there's an importance that copyright may not provide a reason not for making something open access, but there are things other than copyright out there that may provide an important factor here. In terms of the questions that Kim and Michael put forward, the first, what role can libraries play in communities where the local newspapers, local journalism has died out? Are there possibilities to become hubs for reporting? Are there possibilities to provide encouragement, materials, spaces, infrastructure to actually support local journalism, local media? Also, how can libraries build trust in public institutions? I think I said trust now, I think it has to be critical trust. So how is it that you can help someone not trust blindly, not trust without any condition, but actually evaluate and build an understanding of where it's appropriate to trust, where you can have confidence. So that role of libraries and being to some extent, the face of public services and making sure that people don't disconnect, that they aren't missing opportunities is important. Trend 4 is around skills and abilities becoming more complex. Now, and again, this is something that it's not a new trend, but I think it's a particularly important one. But certainly in a digital world, things are moving faster. We're moving from a world certainly where there was information scarcity to one of information abundance, at least for certain language groups and for those who have the ability to connect to the internet. We should not forget that for many language groups and for those who can't connect to the internet, that's absolutely not the case right now. But this means that instead of simply the ability to find information. There's a need to navigate, to deal with this different information. We've talked about those issues of trust, of potential misinformation out there. Economically, we know there's a growing need for people with data skills, with those high-level skills. So there's demand there. Demand seems to be outstripping supply. So in order to make sure that these societies can continue, there's this need to keep training to help more people access those skill sets. It does also mean that those without are at risk of being left behind, or at risk of being left in those jobs that do remain, that require lower skills and risk having lower incomes. A more positive view is that with these developments, there is a growing awareness of the importance of media and information literacy, that whereas once upon a time, maybe it was seen as being something a little bit accessory, that you look at a couple of newspapers and say one is left-wing, one is right-wing, very sort of old-fashioned type of media literacy. Now there's an awareness that it needs to be far more sophisticated and it needs to be far more universal to help people navigate the information space today. In terms of the questions proposed by Michael and Kim, firstly, what is the role of libraries in identifying addressing emerging skills gaps in communities? So how can we use our knowledge of our communities, our knowledge of their needs, to actually help find out what can be done? And of course, think about how we can actually meet those needs. So that understanding, what are people looking for, the questions that they're asking, how to ask the right questions ourselves in order to identify this is a potentially important role. And secondly, looking at how do we do media and information literacy in a way that's actually powerful? How do we get beyond simply spotting the difference between left-wing and right-wing newspapers? How do we get beyond the fact that, of course, AI will get better, it will get harder to spot a fake image, and so the tips and tricks that may have worked a few years ago, that may work now, may no longer work in a few years' time. So how do we keep that media and information literacy curriculum training fresh? It's going to be another question. We've already mentioned the issue of equity in there, but I think the fact that digital technologies are unequally distributed continues to be a trend. And Michael and Kim certainly had a positive impact here, had a positive overall view in terms of there's a positive link between, if we can get digital inclusion right, that will have a positive impact. We know that the digital divide at the moment is deepening. Clearly, there are fewer and fewer people who are offline, although it's important to say that whenever you see a statistic saying that 60–70% of the world are online, this includes people who have access to the equivalent of an ASDL connection one time a month. So there's a huge number of people who are counted as being online, but really don't have particularly meaningful connectivity that allows them to make use of the internet. But of course, as more information, as more services go online, if you don't have that connection, you're a bit stuck. And as I said, it's mentioned here that as services go to digital first, digital only, there's that need to have that digital identity. And this raises potentially two barriers. Firstly, I think, as I said a couple of times already, if you don't have access to, in the first place, to the internet, if you don't have the skills or the competence, you're also then locked out of the services that you need. And as also highlighted a couple of times already, it's often the people who have the least skills, who have the lowest confidence, who also have the highest needs, who really need the support that can be provided in this way. So ironically, there's a risk that through moving to digital, maybe you'll help people in the middle who already have some skills, but you risk leaving those who are further behind still. This will raise questions around digital identity. There are always questions around privacy in there, but also this increasing need to be able to have those, that personal identity, personal ID online in order to access some of these services. If you have one, you're in. If you don't have one, you're out. At the same time, there are ways in which cultural information frameworks can be designed in a positive way. That we already talked under Trend 1 about growing awareness of the value of the fact that in the past, we've been very snobbish, very exclusive about what we count as being valuable information. As things open up, possibilities to gather, to share in a respectful way, elements of the culture of different societies, to allow people to assert themselves, to make themselves known, to make sure they're not drowned out amidst cultural hegemony, that grows. There are those possibilities already hinted at under AI to allow people to access education that previously might have been impossible, to access materials that might have been impossible. So Again, there are possibilities through better access to digital technologies and the associated skills to actually provide to make for that more equitable society. In terms of the questions asked, Kim and Michael highlighted there is clearly an issue in libraries themselves about the sorts of data that we collect. There's always the risk of that tension between collecting data for performance in order to target things and also use analysis, and the fact that actually that data collection can have a chilling effect on people's sense of freedom to actually look for the information they want to. Or they also ask about the access to devices and connections that people have outside the library. To what extent is the library a complementary service? To what extent is the library the last resort? To what extent is the library the gateway, the first opportunity that people have to go online? So thinking about in different societies at different levels of digital development, what is the role of libraries? And certainly it's something that we see across IFLA's work, that the libraries can play a variety of roles, but making sure which is which, adapting our services, our way of doing things accordingly is valuable. Trend 6 focuses on use of resources by information systems. We've probably all heard the information, the data about to what extent data centers use information, the environmental cost of a single search on ChatGPT, or creating one of those little AI images, and the climatic and carbon impact that has. Obviously, these things happen in other countries. It comes with electricity. We don't see it, but the impact is clearly there, and we are a long way from having a purely sustainable energy mix. This raises important questions about, well, is this model, is the way we consume information, or is the volume of information that we consume, the way we use it, actually sustainable right now? There will be pressure through regulation, through simply being responsible citizens to change what we do, to change our habits and our practices. There will also be issues around e-waste, which will change likely the way that we interact with devices. The idea of having devices that change every few years, that's likely to need to change as it becomes more expensive to throw things away. Are we going to see better lasting devices? Are we going to see more recycling, a greater focus on actually repairing and learning to repair ourselves? So the questions again proposed by Kim and Michael. Firstly, to what extent our institutions already have a plan or a policy for minimizing waste generation, but also what is it that we can do to reduce and offset our broader environmental impacts? What are those factors that contribute to our carbon, to our water, to our resource footprint in general? What can we actually do about it? And certainly, of course, the work of the Green Libraries movement, sections like NCLIB within IFLA, provide a really sort of fantastic practical set of step forwards here. And then the final major trend is around seeking community connections. And this is something that I think has been probably strengthened by the pandemic, but I think was already in apparent beforehand, the idea of the techlash, the backlash against excessive use of technology, in the sense that faced with this, people have rediscovered they've rediscovered physical spaces, that the importance of actually having non-commercial spaces open to everyone that allows for what's called extensive as opposed to intensive interaction between people has arguably grown. And in particular, again, linked to the pandemic, the fact that people are tending to spend more time within their local areas, they're traveling less in many cases, at least for those lucky enough to have the potential to work remotely. It means that people have a different relationship with their local area. There's that potential to really build some smaller communities, really focus groups. And so the argument is we are seeing stronger local place-based events and collaborations that build connections, that build an ability to think, to work together, and therefore build resilience and capabilities to solve local problems in an effective way. We're seeing new ways of connecting, a focus on intergenerational contact and intergenerational storytelling, learning from each other, connections that may not have existed before. This doesn't mean that online communities have gone away, and for many groups, especially those with specific needs, specific interests, specific characteristics, there continues to be a value in online communities, that people who may be alone within their own context, who may be alone within their own settings, can find people who are like them, people who can share their ideas. So it's not throwing that away. It's looking at the value of that as a space to actually build connections, to have more fulfillment, to find people who share those things. So the questions that are proposed, then the questions for immediate reflection that are proposed by Kim and Michael. Firstly, what's the role of the library in addressing larger social problems like digital exclusion, poverty, education gaps? So it's being critical, I don't know, looking at some of the gaps, some of the problems, some of the challenges in society that are meaning that not every individual is fulfilling their potential or able to participate fully, but also thinking, what is it that libraries need in terms of skills, resources, status, whatever, in order to become catalysts for community life? And I know that's obviously a topic that is of significant interest in the public library field, but also more broadly. So we talked a little bit earlier. I mentioned at the beginning about the scenarios that we have, and the fact that they're there to catalyze the way we think about things. They're there to make us reflect on potential futures that we might face. I said the report provides 16 of them. We'll talk a little bit about how to use them later. But critically, in each of the ones set out, there's an introduction which sets out some of the thinking, the different trends that came together, in order to put them together. That bit of creative writing, imagination about the future to set out this plausible, coherent world that we might be in subsequently, and then talking a little bit about additional resources that there are. So I will share a couple of these, and then I'm going to go on to the other bit because I'm conscious that we've only got 20 minutes or so left. So the first one, and this is actually the one that I presented a little bit right at the beginning, it's called AI Scalper. And this this builds on the concept, this idea that technologies emerge in response to the fact that for more and more services, for more and more things, you need to queue up, you need to call into a call center. Technologies emerge to actually help you get to the front of the queue, to get faster service than others. And so those who are better able to access the technology because they can pay for it, risk coming forward. Of course, it creates lots of horrible jobs, lots of low-skilled, not particularly fulfilling jobs within call centers. And so obviously the people running the AI, the people who own the AI are doing fine. A lot of people are doing less so. The key themes behind this scenario is that building firstly builds on the fact that we have different needs, that we're in a society that has different functions, that we are facing this rise of AI, this continued impact of misinformation, and some of these issues around the way that knowledge is actually created, but also that interaction with AI, the fact that will change things, impacts around digital technology, digital unfairness, when some people are better able to access technologies than others. So yeah, I'm actually going to stop on this one. I'm going to switch back to the other slideshow in order to talk a little bit. But so very quickly, just say with the scenarios, you've got 16 of them in total, and they all sort of tell stories about where to go. Obviously, I think, as I said a couple of times, I think it's important to underline, none of them are likely to come true, especially not specifically as set out. The idea is to encourage thinking, to highlight potential risks, to make us question some of those assumptions, to make sure that we don't end up, question some of those assumptions, to make sure that we don't end up in a sort of less desirable situation. So I'm going to go back to, there we go. So I think, I don't know, I'm conscious I'm talking a lot. I apologize for that. But as I said, I wanted to come back, having talked about the scenarios, and talked about the trends that you have, but also these sets of potential images of the future that we have. I want to talk a little bit about how to use them and really get to that point of where we're going with that data. But given that I have talked a lot, we're going to ask another question now, which is focusing on actually how we start interacting with those trends. So what you should have now is on your screen a Mentimeter. You will have a set of questions. And for each of the trends set out, so trend 1 about knowledge practices are changing. This is the idea of, you know, what does knowledge mean? Are we accepting more things as knowledge? How do we deal with fake news? Trend 2, the rise of generative AI for good and for bad, the rise of technologies such as digital twins. 3, the renegotiation of trust, the fact that we are simply trust, unconditional trust is no longer really a thing. We need to build critical trust, and the role of libraries in building that, in particular in public services and the media. Greater complexity of skills, the demand for data skills, the demand for information skills, the greater recognition of the value of media information literacy. Uneven distribution of digital technologies, but the potential when they are available to actually make radical changes in people's lives. 6, the increasing use of resources, the environmental pressures, the need for information and knowledge actors such as libraries to respond. And then that 7, that growing need for community connections, those new links being formed. And for each of those, you're being asked to give a sense of how positive overall, given the sub-trends in general terms, how positive you think each trend will be for libraries. And secondly, how strong, how impactful. So, for example, you could have a trend that you think is very powerful, it is very positive for libraries, but actually it's probably only going to have a minimal impact. You're going to put it down saying high positivity, not much strength. So I'm going to take a sip of water and let people answer. Okay, we've got 13 in, so a quarter of you have voted. Let's get up to 20, because we're already seeing a bit of a a bit of a spread here. I'll show you something fun in a second that you can do with this functional Mentimeter. I think once we get up to 20, I think we can start commenting on this one. But I suppose that the idea behind this exercise, and this is exactly the sort of exercise that you can carry out within your own context, both with the trends presented here, but also with trends that you might want to add or change according to your own experience or priorities. The idea is first just to start interacting, to start asking ourselves questions around where we think these things are going. And I think you can tell, especially within this, that there's trends can be both positive and negative, and we'll see examples of both. They can be strong, they can be weak. And this, when we come on to that next question about how they actually interact, that's going to be really interesting. That's going to be a really key question. So, okay, we're up to 25. So what you can see, which is always fun, you can look at the firework from each of these things. So, for example, with trend 1 on knowledge practices, I think we can see that it's moving around a little bit. I think about half of people see that it as being both, maybe a little bit less, fewer than half, see it as being both strong and positive. We have some people think it'll be weak and negative, but we also have some people who say it'll be positive but weak, and some saying positive but strong. So again, you have a real sort of shift, and that's going to keep on moving. This is a lot more fun. Technologies transforming society. You can see it's quite, I think, you can really notice here, there's actually a very high number of people saying that the trend will be strong. So there's broad consensus, but there's some quite dramatic divides between those who feel it will be positive or negative for libraries, which I think, again, is telling. On trust, I think probably it's a little bit more balanced. There's people in every single quadrant there. Of course, the average, again, is both strong and positive. Skills are becoming more clear. I think, again, we see on balance, probably about half, majority saying that it's both strong and positive. Let's go on to it. Get to more interesting ones here. So digital technologies, this is one where we see it as being strong, but actually on average, we're a little bit more concerned about the impact it's going to have for libraries. At the same time, you can see really clusters. Some people very much right up in the top right-hand corner, saying strong and positive, but also a lot of people saying who are very negative about it as a thing. So again, different, and these things, I know, I'm conscious this is a webinar, the format doesn't necessarily make this sort of thing easy, but that does actually raise some interesting questions about, well, I don't know, why do you say one thing, not the other? So if you do use a tool like this within your own context, this is a great conversation starter. 6, again, on information systems, I think people generally tend to see it as being on the more negative side, but actually I think there's general acceptance that it's going to be strong. More positive, I think people are seeking community connections. On average, that's probably the most positive that people see. At the same time, there are different views about how strong it is. There's a fair number of people saying that it's probably not going to make a huge difference overall. So what I will do is I will, we can share this presentation afterwards, so you can look at the results shortly. Do a second exercise, which you can use within your own context. And this is looking, and I got it for 2 of the trends, but given the time, we'll just do it for 1. But it's really interesting to look at the interaction between trends about how we feel that, for example, this trend 1 about knowledge practices are changing, different attitudes to what is knowledge, both in terms of the types of perspective, the experiences that we actually value, the types of information that's available, importance of data, etc. But also that rise of misinformation. How does that actually interact with those other trends that are there? How does that interact with the rise in technology? How does that interact with questions around trust? How does it interact with skills needs in the future around digital inclusion and equity, around environmental issues and around community connections? So I will give you a minute to share ideas there. We've got some coming up already. Take some more water. Yeah, so 14, but I think given time, I'll already start talking, but obviously please do keep the answers coming in. But again, this is just really valuable. It's really interesting as an exercise, and it can be a really good way of just starting a conversation so that we really start to interrogate these trends, actually think about our understandings, our assumptions. So we see already it's trend 7 around people seeking community connections is at the moment coming out as the strongest, which I guess is going to be linked to that is that valorization, that valuing of different types of knowledge, which I think makes it easier to work within communities rather than being focused on one particular body of knowledge that we might have. There may also be negative impacts. The rise of misinformation can drive people apart. It can support filter bubbles. You can see your connection then actually skills have become more complex, which will raise questions. I think again that makes a lot of sense. It as we have different types of knowledge, we need the skills to actually deal with it, the skills to be able to produce, to recognize, to support. We see less connection overall, although on average it's positive about the connection between different knowledge practices and information systems using more resources. Again, this is an example, this is an exercise you can even carry out as a grid and mark down strong, weak, whatever of the relationship between the trends. But again, it's a way just really to interrogate ourselves, to start that conversation about what we know, what we think about the future. I'm going to skip this one given the time. So we've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to go quite quickly on this one. But I think just coming back to what we wanted to do with the trend report, the value of it. I already mentioned at the beginning that it is an equity issue, equal access to futures thinking, equal access to equal habits in thinking about the future can be a really important way of actually ensuring equity in that future. So we've talked about futures thinking as a way of getting a hold of getting ownership of exercising some power, some influence over the future. And in doing that, said it's nice, it is also a duty that if we believe in our mission, if we recognize and value the importance of what we're actually doing, it's really important to be able to make sure that we're able to do it in future. And for our collections, the materials that we hold and that we want to be able to, we invest so much in looking after them today so that they are available in the future. We need to think about what might happen. It's about communities. Libraries have a duty, and we are there as a service to the community. If we're not able to fulfill that service, the community misses out. And of course, to our future selves, that the good decisions we take today will make the jobs of emerging leaders, of future librarians easier. Bad decisions that we take today, those future librarians again have to deal with. So there's really that duty to do as best we can in terms of thinking about that future. And of course, it is an area that we can be good at. It's not IFLA's first trend report came out in 2013. We are far from the only library association, the only library organisation to be applying this work. ALA had a fantastic Centre for Futures for a few years. CILIP recently came out with a report. They were futurists. Sohail and Ayatollah were focused on libraries as an area in this sense. People like Matt Finch are looking at it. So it's a very interesting area. It's one that people have looked at where we can actually do something, really get something done. So in the trend report itself, and I'll put a link in the chat at the end, and you can probably just find it by looking in the search engine of your choice. Already it suggests a set of almost games that you can play, identifying trends, thinking about where you might want to focus, which trends you want to use as your building block, putting together 2x2 grids, that is looking at what happens if trend 1 is more positive or negative, and what happens when that clashes with trend 2 being more positive or negative, and thinking about what different futures that might lead to. We can do scenario planning, and I think in particular in this, looking at what are desirable scenarios, that's always valuable. So coming up with a set of stories of things that might happen, using those to test our ideas. We can be very practical, really imagine a day in the life, and we have scenarios within the collection, within the report that actually do this. And then actually planning for uncertainty, taking a set of scenarios, developing a plan, and then at the end only deciding which of the scenarios applies, and then reflecting back on, well, did we make the right choices? Was it the right decision? So in the trend report, what you also have access to is a bit of an exploration, a bit of a journey through the logic of futures thinking in general. The idea, again, it points to a lot of resources that are out there that are valuable. There's a mixture of those from the public sector, some really useful work that's been done in the US and Canada and the UK and other countries, as well as resources from, for example, this is from Futures Platform, which is a Finnish organization and offers some really good, really excellent blogs and other materials that help you think and reflect a little bit about what are different ways of looking at the future. So, for example, here, this is a fantastic breakdown of what it is that we mean by trends, and they talk about futures intelligence. So we have the word trends in there. There's very broad things, understanding the big scale picture, but also it's beginning to look through about what are drivers of trends, what are weak signals, things that are maybe happening in 1 or 2 libraries today or 1 or 2 communities today that may become very widespread in future. So there's some really useful ways of just building up that discipline, some fantastic tools, guidebooks that have been created for governments, for other organizations that we can absolutely use ourselves. It talks through the process of defining trends, carrying out research, using everything that's available, using popular wisdom, getting people together to use the Delphi method, to use stages of discussion to come up with ideas about what the future might be. Ideas about how to look out for those weak signals, things that maybe aren't trends today, but have the potential to be huge in future. To look at how they might play out politically, economically, environmentally, socially. There's some great tools in there. And also then about also then using these as a way of stress testing assumptions. It talks about ways of going about developing scenarios. So I think what's called branch analysis. You start with a certain trend, and you ask yourself, going year by year into the future, well, and what might this mean by then? And then on that basis, what might it mean in the future? So you can build out. You can also have scenarios and do backcasting. So you have your idea of the future and you look back at what might need to be in place, what might need to happen to actually arrive at that scenario. You can work in both directions. You can look at those 2x2 grids, the interaction of uncertainties. You can apply as a model that's archetypal thinking. And so you assume there are 4 different ways in which the world might go: business as usual, decline, incremental change, radical transformation. So you can use these as a tool for coming up with scenarios for the future. So there's an awful lot in there, also about how we test our plans. You can talk about wind tunneling or stress testing are some of the terms that are in there. Thinking hard about, well, if we do A, B, and C, and this happens in the future, are we still there? Are we stronger? Are we weaker? Were these the right choices? There's some really useful materials in there about how we map systems, really think about how we work together as ourselves in a system, but also work with other actors, That's a really good way of then thinking through the impacts of potential changes. And of course, the SWOT, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis. There's guidance in there about that and links to further resources. So 3 minutes from time, so I've obviously timed this okay. And I'm going to give I have seen a couple of questions come up in the chat, which I've not been looking at so far, but I am going to be looking at now. So 2 questions. Thank you, Jerome. Calling a report dealing with future 2024 an issue. So I think it's a question that we have right now. Obviously, the report came out in 2024. It is tied to the time that it comes from. That is inevitable. I think the guidance that really comes from a lot of professionals in this area is that we need to avoid, it's not even a case of doing it annually. It's a case of how do we actually build up that discipline of looking at things regularly. Now, we're not promising and we don't have the resources to come out with a trend report every year, but we are exploring how do we actually make this into a regular process, a regular way that we sort of interrogate what we're doing, build up, make a habit of coming up with these discussions. We've also continued to produce material. We produced the original report came out in 24. We produced an updated report, including with the whole chapters about futures this year. We've also produced the skills agenda that came out this year as well, 2025, which looks at a set of potential skills needs that we have going into the future. So more materials have come out. I'm extremely grateful to the emerging leaders who made that work possible. But as I said, it's a PDF. We have to be honest about when this comes from and accept that the trends we set out in 24 may not be the trends that we believe are important in 25 or 26. It's a starting point, and that's really something we want to focus on. Second question from Jerome focuses on the key features that make this report and the results different. In some ways, we're looking at the same issues, and you will see parallels with the 2013 trend report. I think potentially what's different within there, I think it's that focus on scenarios. I think that is a qualitative change and actually providing that catalyst for discussion that's in there. I think that's substantive change. The focus on the skills agenda, starting to interrogate ourselves around that. Again, that's an area of change. Plus also a lot of those materials focusing on, well, how do you do futures thinking? How do we do futures thinking ourselves? We don't need to just leave it to the experts or an expensive consultant. This is something that we can take on. So this is there. I would also say that if this report is saying similar things to the 2013 one, it's because the 2013 one did a good job and picked trends that were relevant and continue to be relevant. So I wouldn't see that as a failure of now in any way. I'd see that as a success of the past, and I hope that we will be able to say much the same about this year's report in a few years' time. But as said, the idea is absolutely not just to say, like, we've done it, we don't need to do futures, we don't need to do trends for the next 5 years. This is something that we'll be coming back to. And then I think the next 2 questions actually fit together, and these will be the last ones I answer because I don't want to eat into your time. I think both of these focus on the question of how do we integrate futures thinking and future readiness into our regions, into work at all levels. And I think, as I said at the beginning, there's a key equity issue in here. Futures work done unevenly, done in some parts of the world, in some sectors rather than others, risks being a factor of inequality, driving people apart rather than driving them together. And I think one thing that we certainly need to think about is how do we make sure that those structures that we have, professional structures, regional structures across IFLA, are able to really use the report to draw on it. And I think certainly that leaves me with a piece of work that I need to do, looking at that. But I think it's also a next step, I think, is really looking at how can we build simple tools, or at least point people to tools that are there that can be adapted regardless of the level of resource, the level of sophistication, the size of an institution. We need to be able to make futures thinking possible, both for individuals looking simply to be more reflective, to be more critical about the future, but also the largest associations. So how can we actually turn these into tools? I think in particular we have, and some of the emerging leaders who put together the skills agenda, actually have already been looking at developing their own training tools that they've been taking out to their community. So I know one thing that we will be looking to do on our website is bring together some of those examples, and also making sure that we're really bringing in futures thinking alongside some of the other areas where we look to provide ideas and insights. Given that we are over time, I am going to cut us off there, just because I'm conscious we started late, but people have other things to do, especially those joining us late in the evening. I would just underline right at the end that this report has been developed for the library field as a whole. It's there, it is a tool. It is not sacred. It is not to be touched. It's there to be dissected, extracted from, torn apart, put back together again in a way that really works for you. So it really is, it is a tool. It's not, there's no sanctity to it. And actually, that's a good thing if you do it, because if you do it, you have interrogated it, you've taken it apart, looked at what's inside, asked your own questions. We are interested in suggestions about how to make this easier, about relevant tools that could actually help make the step. I think we're aware that this is a long document in English, which can be forbidding and can be a barrier for some. And so please do get in touch with us, ifla.org, with any ideas, any suggestions that you have about how we can actually make this more useful for more people. I'm going to skip that because we are at the end, but so I just wanted to say finally, as some thanks. So thanks to Kim, who actually put together a chunk of the slides there, for which I'm extremely grateful for. Plus, of course, to Kim and Michael for the huge work that's been carried out in putting this together. To the Queensland University of Technology Digital Media Research Centre for making them available for us. To the Gates Foundation, whose funding made this possible via SIGIL. To our Trend Report advisory committees, to all those who submitted contributions to the report. I very much encourage you look through. There's a lot in there. It is very dense, and any suggestions again that you have about how we can make the most of it, how we can really get the most of it as a tool for the field, are very welcome. But with that, I want to simply say thank you to you all for joining us today. It's been really good to have you here. I hope it's been useful for you, and I look forward to seeing you at another event. So thank you very much.